been said about abortion rights, but what often is missing from mainstream discourse is reproductive justice. It was a caucus of black feminists in 1994 who first created the term reproductive justice, an ideology that not only includes a woman's right to birth control and abortion, but also women's rights to have children and raise them in a quality and healthy environment. More strictly defined, reproductive justice is all people having the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about their gender, bodies, sexuality, and families for themselves and their communities. In past episodes of this series, we've discussed how black women have been stereotyped as lascivious Jezebels, how white women have been placed on pedestals, fears about racial integration, the desire for reproductive choice, how class informs sexual experiences, and perhaps most importantly, how sexual trends and attitudes about those trends impact the political and social order. So how did all of these concepts converge to create a problem that has traumatized black, Latina, and indigenous women for decades? In this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll be discussing sterilization, abuse, and reproductive justice. Of the 20th century, around 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized across 32 states, all in the name of eugenics. Charles Darwin's distant cousin Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883 with the intent of expressing the science of improving stock by giving the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. Positive eugenics was the theory of bettering the white race by increasing reproduction of the best stock. Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed, "Willful sterility is, from the standpoint of the nation, from the standpoint of the human race, the one sin for which there is no atonement," demonstrating the emphasis placed on certain women and men to breed. Meanwhile, negative eugenics was the theory of decreasing and ultimately stopping reproduction of inferior stock. Unsurprisingly, this is the type of eugenics that caught on the most. A few years before the term was introduced in 1877, there was something called the Jukes study. A sociologist studied 42 New York families and collectively named them the Jukes. The subjects weren't all related, but many were prostitutes, vagrants, imprisoned for crime, or other types of perceived ne'er-do-wells. On this shaky foundation of evidence, it was falsely established that poverty and crime were hereditary. This study inspired similar ones in eventual eugenics legislation. Social scientists and progressives of the early 20th century were eager to attack what they deemed to be social ills like poverty and promiscuity, two things they could easily blame on feeble-mindedness and inferior breeding. The first sterilization law came from Indiana in 1907 and others quickly followed. The superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office, Harry Hamilton Laughlin, advocated a schedule to sterilize 15 million people in 2 generations. He also introduced a model sterilization law that he wanted states to implement. In March 1924, Virginia authorized the forced sterilization of people in government asylums, and the law was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1927's Buck v. Bell. The first woman sterilized under Virginia's law was a white woman named Carrie Buck. Believe it or not, most eugenics programs initially targeted poor white women. For instance, one Georgia medical journal claimed that the South's poor white trash would choke civilization in a wilderness of weeds if sterilization was not implemented. When Carrie became pregnant before her 17th birthday, her foster parents had her institutionalized as a feeble-minded moral delinquent, even though she tried telling them that she had been raped by their nephew. She joined her biological mother, Emma, at the local colony camp for delinquent women. Emma had been imprisoned because she was accused of being a prostitute and having syphilis. While there, a doctor sought to have Carrie sterilized and wanted to justify using the Virginia law by examining Carrie, her daughter, and her mother. Despite finding the daughter, Vivian, to have average intelligence, doctors and legislators colluded via Buck v. Bell to have Carrie deemed morally deficient and eligible for sterilization. The judge ruled 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Buck v. Bell has never been overturned. Strictly under eugenics laws, Virginia would come to sterilize at least 8,300 citizens by the 1970s, but that number pales in comparison to a certain state. Can you guess which one? Before you guess, it's shockingly not in the South, it's California. Yep, that's right. The state known for legal weed and having a liberal mecca called Hollywood forcibly sterilized at least 20,000 people under eugenics laws in the 20th century. The California experiment, as it came to be called, was was a massive influence to Nazi Germany. In California, Mexican people were a significant target. Latino men were 23% more likely to be sterilized than non-Latino men, and Latinas were sterilized at 59% higher rates than non-Latinas. But let's back that up real quick. Mexican people had long lived in the country and had been mistreated. For example, in 1851, it was reported by a San Francisco newspaper that a Mexican woman had been hanged for killing a man when he and a group of his drunken, rapey friends broke into her house believing it to be a brothel. But between 1910 and 1930, the number of Mexican immigrants had tripled, as many people were escaping from the violence of the Mexican Revolution. It's not surprising that their presence and culture ticked off many racist and nativist white Americans, and this was even more true after Mexican laborers increasingly began organizing for better working conditions after 1915. Whites also weren't a fan of the tradition of big families, leading to the further embrace of the stereotype of hyper-fertile and promiscuous Mexican women. Criminalized and demonized as mentally inferior, Mexicans were incarcerated and institutionalized and subjected to coercive and outright forced sterilization. Records show numerous Mexican American families protested their loved one's sterilization when they were notified of the impending procedure. Though chances of failure were high, they often sought support from legal aid services, the Mexican consulate, and the Catholic Church. During the 30s, the location of most sterilizations moved from the west to the south, and by the late 1950s, Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina were responsible for 3/4 of all U.S. sterilizations. But before we discuss the forced sterilization of black women in the South, largely through Medicaid programs, let me address Puerto Rico. By 1933, U.S. sugar companies had monopolized the island, which eventually pushed thousands of underpaid agricultural laborers into increasingly militant labor unions. Puerto Rican nationalism was also on the rise. To protect its interests, the U.S. needed to control the population of the island. In 1939, poverty in Puerto Rico was blamed on overpopulation, and Roosevelt's Interdepartmental Committee on Puerto Rico decided to reduce the birth rate to no more than the level of the death rate. And by the 1970s, over 35% of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age have been sterilized. This is the highest rate of sterilization in the world. The program had been masterminded by Dr. Clarence Gamble, who helped get the Negro Project for Family Planning underway in the South. It was quite common for Puerto Rican women with 2 children to have their tubes tied after giving birth. Though the citizens of Puerto Rico were largely Catholic and the Catholic Church initially opposed sterilization in the country, that changed. As Anthony Stevens Arroyo wrote, using the pill was characterized as a continual sin that required the constant withholding of communion. Submitting to the operation, on the other hand, was a one-time offense that could be confessed and then allow regular communion. But also, back in the States, as many as 20 to 25% of indigenous women were sterilized in America between 1970 and 1976 alone. It was plotted genocide. As one physician proudly reported, all the pureblood women of the Kaw tribe of Oklahoma have now been sterilized. At the end of the generation, the tribe will cease to exist. Because indigenous women were forced into reservations and relocated into urban areas without resources and livable wages, poverty was a frequent reality. These women were highly dependent on government agencies like the Indian Health Services and Department of Health. They were routinely operated on by white doctors who assumed they knew what was best. They claimed that sterilizing these women was better than letting them have children and become welfare burdens. In 1958, Mississippi State Representative David H. Glass introduced a bill that would require unmarried women to be sterilized if they gave birth to an illegitimate child, claiming that he wanted to reduce the welfare rolls. These types of bills popped up in the 60s and 70s and were never implemented, but certainly set a tone. By 1976, 43% of the women sterilized through federally subsidized programs were black. There are a number of women you should know about. In my home state of North Carolina, over 8,000 sterilizations were documented and approved by the State Eugenics Board, in addition to all of the women who were just sterilized by their doctors who thought they knew best. 85% of the people sterilized were women, and by the late 60s, 60% of them were black. 1/3 of the women sterilized in North Carolina by the Eugenics Board were under 18 when the procedure was performed, with some as young as 9. Elaine Riddick was sterilized at 14 after giving birth to a baby conceived by rape. The consent form for her procedure was signed by her illiterate grandmother, who was threatened with the loss of her welfare benefits. Elaine didn't find out she was sterile until years later when trying for a baby with her husband. Another woman, Niall Ruth Cox, was sterilized with the approval of the state in 1965. Cox was 18, unmarried, and the mother of a 10-week-old girl. Her mother was a welfare recipient, and there were 10 people total living in their home. Cox had been threatened with the discontinuation of her mother's welfare benefits if she didn't get sterilized, and was assured the procedure was temporary. The doctor who performed the procedure said she was mentally deficient. Years later, when Cox found out she was sterile and sued the state in the 70s, the case was thrown out, with the court ruling she waited too long. Both of these stories have in common a threat of ending welfare benefits. And just like the sterilization of the indigenous women, the excuse given was that it would reduce the welfare rolls. In the aftermath of the knowledge of the atrocities of Nazi Germany in the mid-20th century, many states stopped or slowed down their eugenics programs. Eugenics was discredited as racist bad science. But that doesn't mean the abuse of minority women stopped, especially with the events of the 60s. Black civil unrest combined with explosively racist theories about black intelligence and abilities. As I've discussed in other intellectual media content, the fiercest opposition to welfare came about when welfare came to be associated with black women, after they successfully fought for a larger share of benefits in the late 60s. Though the benefits had been doled out abundantly to white mothers and families since the Great Depression, it was black women receiving such help that led to welfare programs being reduced, diminished, and demonized. So it is completely unsurprising that black women, who were seen as undesirable and irresponsible mothers, were threatened with having their benefits taken away. Recall the indigenous women who were sterilized to ease the costs associated with welfare. In a capitalist society where an impoverished and exploited underclass is a key component of maintaining wealth, welfare is the one safety net. Welfare wouldn't be so expansive and expensive if poverty was properly tackled. Hold on to that thought because we'll come back to it. There are tons of other sterilization horror stories. In Aiken, South Carolina, a doctor named Close Pierce sterilized at least 18 women on Medicaid with 2 or more children. He was the only obstetrician in town, and he said pregnant women on welfare would have to submit if they wanted him to deliver their babies, because he was tired of people running around and having babies and paying for them with my taxes. According to Intimate Matters, one dissident doctor in the Southwest reported one staff member would lie to the patient if he felt she had too many kids and tell her uterus needed to come out when it didn't. In Alabama in 1973, 2 black girls named Minnie Lee, age 12, and Mary Alice, age 14, were sterilized when their mother, who was illiterate, was tricked by a social worker into putting an X on the officiating document. She believed it was for Depo-Provera shots, which, by the way, hadn't even been approved by the FDA yet. A lawsuit and investigation found that an estimated 100 to 150,000 poor women had been sterilized annually under federally funded programs that incentivized the procedure for doctors. In Mississippi, the term Mississippi appendectomy came to be known for when a black woman entered a hospital for treatment or a procedure and unknowingly received a hysterectomy. Hysterectomies are much more complicated and dangerous than tubal ligations and more expensive. For example, in 1975, a hysterectomy cost $800, while a tubal ligation cost $250. Doctors, reimbursed for their services by Medicaid, did the capitalist thing, of course. Even though hysterectomies were 20 times more likely to kill a woman than a tubal ligation, guess which procedure they usually performed on black women? Activist Fannie Lou Hamer was forcibly sterilized this way in a Mississippi hospital, and this is what led to her being an outspoken advocate for black rights and voting in the state. In 1973, it was reported that 14 states debated legislation to coerce women on welfare to get sterilized. A sponsor of one of these bills stated, "People who live like animals should be treated as such." While this was happening, a certain sect of white feminists were finding it increasingly difficult to get their tubes tied voluntarily. In fact, in 1970, the ACLU launched a lawsuit campaign to challenge hospitals who didn't perform elective sterilization. To many white feminists, access to tubal ligation procedures meant reproductive freedom. It was mainly minority women who discussed the traumatic reality of sterilization abuse. In the late 70s, the Committee to End Sterilization sterilization abuse was founded. They introduced two important guidelines for federal sterilization reform: the requirement of informed consent for the procedure and a 30-day waiting period between the signing of the consent form and the actual procedure. In 1978, sterilization came under strict rules thanks to these provisions, but that didn't stop black women from being coerced into sterilization. As Dorothy Roberts explained in the 90s, current government funding policy continues to encourage sterilization of poor women. The federal government pays for sterilization services under the Medicaid program, while it doesn't make available information about and access to certain other contraceptive techniques in abortion. In effect, sterilization was for decades the only publicly funded birth control method readily available to poor women of color. Sterilization isn't over, and eugenicist thinking continues today. California banned eugenic sterilization in 1979, but they weren't done abusing women. Between 2006 and 2010, 146 inmates in 2 women's prisons had their tubes tied. Most were black and Latina. Doctors were paid $147,000 for their work, and the story broke in 2013 and led to a ban on sterilization in California state prisons. It was just in 2008 that a Louisiana state representative proposed a plan to pay poor women $1,000 to get their tubes tied. He also advocated in the same program to include tax incentives for college-educated, higher-income people to have more children. While Depo-Provera, the injectable birth control, was denied FDA approval between 1967 and 1992, the contraceptive was routinely used on Southern black and Native women in the 70s and 80s under coercion and outright force. But let's talk about the implant contraceptive Norplant. The implant prevented pregnancy for 5 years and was approved for marketing by the FDA in 1990. Norplant was originally developed by the Population Council as a tool of population control in developing countries like Indonesia to be given to poor and uneducated women of color. The Population Council was researched and funded with $95 million in U.S. aid, and back in 1969, the council's president, Bernard Berelson, said he was considering a fertility control agent that would be available in 10 to 15 years and that it would be included in the water supply in urban areas. When Norplant was introduced on the American market, it very quickly came to be seen as a way to deal with the welfare problem. The 1980s Reagan Revolution had partially hinged on the demonization of the alleged black welfare queen. After all, the 1980s Reagan Revolution had partially hinged on the demonization of the alleged black welfare queen, and those sentiments were still strong. Only 2 days after the FDA approved Norplant, the Philadelphia Inquirer published a controversial op-ed in which the author claimed the main reason more black children are living in poverty is that people having the most children are the ones least capable of supporting them. He then went on to encourage states to offer women incentives for using Norplant. By the way, at the time, black people actually had the smallest families out of all the races in the country. Though many black leaders were rightfully pissed, the idea took hold. Even the black mayor of DC, Marion Barry, supported making Norplant mandatory for women on welfare. He said, "You can have as many babies as you want, but when you start asking the government to take total care of them, the government now ought to have some control over you." Every state quickly made Norplant available to poor women on Medicaid, and by 1994, states had spent over $34 million on distributing the contraceptive. The implant itself cost $365, and the procedure cost $150 to $500. The contraceptive was pushed aggressively on black teen girls in Baltimore, and it became available at some school clinics in urban areas. By 1992, 13 states had proposed bills to implant poor women with Norplant, usually to qualify for welfare benefits. None of these bills passed, but the sentiment was clear. Poor women who procreated were seen as irresponsible burdens of the state. There are numerous anecdotes about women being hassled into being implanted with Norplant immediately after giving birth. Some of these women were only given the option of long-acting birth controls like Norplant and Depo, but not the pill, the contraceptive of choice for most white women. Some judges offered Norplant as an alternative to jail for women convicted of drug abuse. Now, before you go thinking those women shouldn't have kids anyways, consider a few things. Think about the crack baby media sensationalism of the late 80s and early 90s. First, addiction is a disease that people need treatment for. Unfortunately, finding affordable treatment for addiction is difficult in the present day. It was even more difficult in the late 80s and early 90s, especially if you were pregnant. Secondly, as explained in this video available available on YouTube, crack is less harmful to unborn fetuses than alcohol and tobacco, two things ingested by pregnant white women at higher rates than pregnant black women. That brings me to my third point. Black women are disproportionately targeted for drug testing, but that doesn't mean they do drugs more than white women. When you mix all these ingredients together, you've got a recipe for criminalizing reproduction. Writes Dorothy Roberts, when a drug-addicted woman becomes pregnant, she has only one realistic avenue to escape criminal charges: abortion. It's unlikely that the pregnant addict will be able to find a drug treatment program that'll accept her. Even if she does, she may not be able to overcome her addiction in time. In early 90s Greenville, South Carolina, pregnant women, disproportionately black, were randomly drug tested. If they were found with something in their system, they were shackled to their beds and their babies taken from them. Then they'd be required to get clean if they wanted their children back and didn't want to be prosecuted. As Roberts pointed out, many of these women faced transportation obstacles and couldn't actually find treatment. Unsurprisingly, many black mothers ended up in prison. Roberts wrote, "It was 2 years after the Greenville solicitor started prosecuting women that the county opened a residential treatment facility for pregnant Medicaid-eligible women, a facility with only 10 beds to deal with an estimated 1,500 drug-related births a year." She also mentioned how pregnant addicts who seek help from hospitals are the ones most likely to be reported to the government, scaring many away from going for drug treatment or prenatal care. White women are more likely to have private health care and less likely to be tested for drugs. Think about what restricted abortion access could mean for drug-addicted women of color. They could be criminalized for bringing a child to term and coerced into sterilization or a possibly dangerous long-acting contraceptive. Did you know there's a private organization called Project Prevention that pays drug-addicted women $300 to be sterilized? It started in the UK but now headquarters in North Carolina. While politicians and newspaper editors were singing its praises, women on the contraceptive tended to feel a bit differently. Low-income women were less likely to visit doctors and have possible side effects monitored. If a woman suffered from debilitating side effects, she often faced obstacles in removing the implant. Some doctors refused, claiming they just needed to get used to it. It's no wonder that by 1996, over 50,000 women had filed lawsuits against the manufacturers of Norplant, alleging that they didn't properly warn about the plethora of side effects. The company, Wyeth, didn't lose a single lawsuit and 14,000 claims were dismissed. But in 1999, the remaining 36,000 women were offered $1,500 to settle out of court. Wyeth ultimately took Norplant off the American market in 2002. How crazy does it sound that sterilization is federally funded by Medicaid, but abortion legally can't be thanks to 1976 Hyde Amendment? Very crazy, but not crazier than free, quality prenatal health care not being a universal right in this country. Not crazier than highly unaffordable housing being more common than affordable housing. Nor is it crazier than standard wages in line with the cost of living and inflation being less common than minimum wage that barely covers housing alone. All of this stuff is equally crazy and the complete opposite of reproductive justice. Women deserve the right to abort a pregnancy if they choose. They also deserve the right to carry a pregnancy to term, no matter how poor they are or no matter their marital status, and have resources at their disposal like quality schools, well-paying jobs, quality housing, and quality health care. Poor black women should not have to forego motherhood. Poor black women should not have to forego prenatal care because of ridiculous costs. This is something that would help ease the black maternal and infant death rate. When poor black women have children, which is a fundamental human right, reproductive justice means not blaming society's ills, I'm talking poverty, exploitative capitalism, and mass incarceration, on them. Consider this. Fewer than 6% of children in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden are poor. I mentioned that in this video here. But these countries have higher birth rates to single women than the US, where over 20% of children are poor. That's because these countries have vast social safety net programs and living wages. Experts from a bipartisan congressional study found that the true key to ending child poverty, and by extension adult poverty, is providing livable wages, affordable health care, affordable housing, and child tax credits. Conservatives claim to believe that making people on welfare work or giving them long-acting contraceptives will end poverty. But these are just convenient lies that alleviate blame from greedy corporations in the prison industrial complex. While liberals rightfully believe that the pro-life movement is a monstrous infringement on on a woman's right to choose what she does with her body, they must acknowledge that simply providing access to birth control and abortion is not enough. Birth control should not be lauded as a way to reduce poverty and welfare costs. That has roots in eugenicist thinking. Instead, birth control should be one of the options a woman has, no matter how poor, when she is planning her family. Less poor people is not the answer to ending poverty. Investing in social programs and destroying capitalist exploitation is. Reproductive justice calls for living wages, comprehensive sex ed, the abolition of prisons, and universal health care so that women not only make informed decisions about motherhood, but have the ability to take care of their children without being criminalized or demonized as government leeches. If there is no reproductive justice, then there will continue to be cycles of poor children and mothers coerced into sterilization, cajoled into prison, and neglected by the state. Consider the fact that immunological contraceptives or birth control that will regulate fertility by manipulating the body's immune responses is currently being developed. Think of pills that could prevent pregnancy for years with a single dose. For women who don't want to ever have children, this sounds amazing. But for women who want to have children to the dismay of politicians and racists, this sounds like another type of abuse waiting to happen. We've talked about a lot during the season of Let's Talk About Sex History, but are you ready for the final episode? In the season finale, we'll be discussing pussy, power, and patriarchy.